I don't remember much about the summer before I started college, but I do remember flipping out at the university when they sent me my housing accommodations. It was just that they assigned me to the most expensive residence hall, and I was going to an art school that I really could not afford as it was, so the idea that the price tag was getting even bigger was super overwhelming. But they had already assigned me to a roommate, and I still remember his name to this day. I'm not going to say it because I feel like that's not right, but I will say that it struck me as a remarkably unusual name. I think we exchanged an email or two, but eventually the university heeded my demands and put me in the cheap dorm, which is where I met the guy who had actually become my roommate, Cody Duckworth. And loyal fans of Opinion Science will remember Cody from the intro to episode 6, when I talked to him as a way into my interview with a film critic. Cody was there to learn filmmaking, and he introduced me to a lot of wild films that year. And, when I think about it, this fluke of roommate assignments really charted the course for the rest of my time in art school in a lot of ways. So much of what became our friend group was this weird product of the two of us. We were very different from each other in many ways, but that was super formative for me, I think, to have gotten so well acquainted with him and the friends that we shared. And I can't help but wonder, what if I hadn't made a stink about that first dorm room assignments? What if the boy with the unusual name was my roommate instead? How much can these flips of a coin in our lives change us? You're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how we talk about them. I'm Andy Luttrell, and this week I've got two incredible guests. Sarah Gaither is an associate professor of psychology at Duke University, and Analia Albuja is an assistant professor of psychology at Northeastern University. They both study the complexities of racial identity and ways to improve relations between groups. And they just published an important new study looking at the effects of a random roommate policy on students' ability to develop diverse social networks. It follows up on some research that Sarah did in grad school. If a student goes to college and a coin flip essentially determines whether they're living 2 feet from someone whose racial background is different from their own, does it make any difference? We'll talk about why this study offers us a useful glimpse into a bigger set of questions and what we can learn from their results. You might notice that this is reminiscent of a topic I covered on this show a while ago, which is the contact hypothesis. It's an episode of Opinion Science that I'm still very proud of, and if you haven't listened to it, check it out. You'll get the history of this idea, the state of the science, and some recent experiments in Iraq and India that help us understand whether bringing different people together can actually chip away at prejudice. You'll also hear from lots of cool and interesting people along the way. It's episode 44, The Contact Hypothesis. But let's get into this week's show, which is an important new look at this old idea. Okay, so I think before we get too into the weeds, maybe we can start by talking about what contact theory is. So this is an idea that's come up on this podcast before, but I think a refresher is going to be helpful for people to understand what you were doing. So I'll also kind of let either of you take the reins as you like. I'll kind of just throw questions out if I don't have a specific person to address them to. But to either of you, what would you say is the basic premise of contact that you would sort of characterize like a quick definition of contact that's going to help set the stage for the work that you've done?
I can go ahead and go first, Annalie, unless you have something else to add. But the original contact theory was proposed by Alport in 1954, which largely argues that contact between members of different groups under very specific conditions can work together to reduce prejudice, improve attitudes toward those groups, and improve intergroup conflict.
And so when you say contact, what is the notion? What did Alport have in mind when he talked about contact?
Yeah, and there's been tons of work since Alport initially defined this theory. And really, most researchers, I think, would argue there's 4 conditions that need to be met in order for contact. So how much you talk to someone, and this needs to be meaningful contact, which is really key. So it's not just sitting next to someone on a bus every day, but it's actually having a conversation with that person, meaningfully connecting with them. So the main conditions that are usually argued to be required to see some of these positive attitude changes are having equal group status with the other person from the other group, having some sort of common goal in mind, intergroup cooperation. So you're cooperating on some sort of task or in some specific context. And the one that I think is actually not studied very often is what they call support from authority, which means you have some sort of policy or bigger entity of some kind that is arguing for why this contact should be happening and importantly, why it should not be happening, right? So if you have someone telling you you shouldn't interact with X group, that's not going to be an optimal context to see some of these positive attitude changes, at least based on contact theory.
And so really it's just sort of bringing people together at all, right? Like under these conditions, of course, but just like, whether that's having lunch or going on a walk or working on a project together. My sense is that contact can sort of incorporate lots of different ways in which people come together and interact with one another. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, any form of contact. I think most people study in the forms of positive contact, not necessarily negative contact, but yeah, and Annalie, you have stuff to add.
I was just going to add that I think the literature has extended in interesting ways to think about extended contact and vicarious contact, like internet mediated contact. So thinking about the ways that we might have some of a version of contact that is our friend is friends with or has contact with an outgroup member, and us by learning about their contact, could those those effects kind of trickle down to us and vicarious. So there's work on imagined contact. So even just kind of going through the idea of thinking about what it would be like to interact with or have contact with someone from a different group seems to have some effects as well. So it's kind of expanded to a broad definition of contact.
Do you get the sense too that like contact is really built to address this gap that otherwise occurs in people's experiences? This kind of tees up the work that you've done, which is to say that like, is the real premise that people just don't typically have this kind of experience, and so they're basing their ideas about other groups on a fantasy that they're picking up from media or stereotypes or things that they've heard, and it's only by actually having meaningful, strong contact with another group that people can go like, oh, actually, this is fine. Does it seem like that's kind of what contact is addressing?
Yeah, I think like reduced anxiety is one of the main mechanisms that has been found. So being less concerned with just kind of having smoother interpersonal interactions by actually kind of what you're saying, like maybe humanizing or individuating someone that had previously been maybe only presented in broad strokes of societal perceptions or stereotypes is one way through how this works.
So that it's more of an emotional hang up that people are just like, without that experience, they kind of dread these sorts of interactions. But once they have those experiences, they're more adept at navigating those kinds of intergroup interactions.
Yeah, I sort of think of contact as it's like going to the gym and working out any other muscle, right? When you first try contact with a new group, you first try out a new workout regimen at the gym, right? It's difficult at first, right? But the more you practice it, the more you get used to it and the more experience you have with it, you're going to see less anxiety when you walk onto that treadmill the next time, or less anxiety when you meet a new person from a different group going forward, right? And I think what we see a lot, particularly in US society, is we live in a really segregated society still. Even though we're becoming very diverse in lots of different definitions of that word, we're still seeing that people are living with people exactly like themselves, even outside of a college context, right? Within our neighborhood structures, how income is equated across different group lines. So without forced contact, which is really what motivated a lot of our work here, you miss these opportunities to learn from each other.
So you looked specifically at the context of college roommates, and I'm curious of all the ways in which people can come together. Why college roommates? Was there anything unique about this dynamic that made it kind of a perfect way to consider contact in action?
So for me, I was trained as a social psychologist, but I've always had a developmental background and a developmental training. And going to college is this really meaningful point in developmental times in our lives, right? We are figuring out who we are, what we are. Most people, if you're moving off to a four-year college or institution, you're moving away from your friends and family. So it really is a big identity shifting moment. So if things are fragile or malleable in any way, college is going to be that time, right? When you're forced to grapple with the things you have learned, the things you are learning in this new context. You're meeting people for the first time across all different backgrounds. Tons of research has shown the average person going to college hasn't had a meaningful cross group contact before they've gotten there. You've only hung out with people in your neighborhood. So for me, it's this very nice, almost semi-controlled, nerdy social psychology context where everyone is moving to a new environment for the first time and everyone is on the same level and trying to figure out who it is they want to be during this college experience.
It's also happening just down the street from the psych department. I imagine it's also handy too.
True. That's also true. But all of us are on college campuses, right? And I think this is one thing about looking at these naturally existing forms of contact rather than forcing it in a lab through a lab protocol, right? Looking at how it is students are learning about themselves and through each other in good ways and bad ways, whether it's the romantic partners or through the friends that they're making in classes or the new student groups that are even offered during one's first year of college, right? Those welcome day weeks when students realize, I never had an interest in X before. Maybe I would be good at that. And we have some of our data is showing some increases in flexible thinking just from living with people who are different from oneself. So I think there's a lot of benefits to come from exploring yourself in all different ways during your first year of college.
It makes sense that college in general is like a perfect kind of microcosm to look at these kinds of things in, but like roommates in particular, I often talk about how like roommate assignments are kind of this giant randomized social experiment that just gets rolled out naturally every year. What is it about roommate pairings that make it particularly helpful as a tool for studying contact?
It's such a unique opportunity because it meets like a lot of this criteria of like it's a lot of contacts. It's not just a one-off. You're living together in a room with this person. You have a lot of opportunities to get to know each other, and theoretically have equal status going in as roommates. You share the common goal, hopefully, of wanting to cohabitate successfully, or like all of these conditions lead to like the possibility of friendship and the opportunity of having a lot of sustained contact with the same person. So I think all of those things make it a really unique opportunity to study this specific phenomenon.
Yeah, the institutional support part I hadn't appreciated in this roommate context before, because that's always the condition of all ports that I've struggled to like really grasp, like, what does that actually mean? But it makes total sense in this situation that it's like, well, the institution is saying we want to randomly pair people together regardless of their demographic makeup. And so that like is a very clear signal that like this is an intentional part of being a part of this institution.
Yeah, and I think one big concern I've had with a lot of contact theory across my career is contact theory tends to only be measured on people who are already naturally opting in to wanting to talk to someone from a different group. All right. And so contact theory is not going to work if you don't actually ever meet someone from a different background. And we know that people who are very segregated, right, in different ways in their lives aren't going to seek out an additional opportunity to diversify their friend network, for example. So with the support from authority angle through a roommate policy change on a university campus, it's actually a really easy way to give everyone a chance at being able to opt in, right? Everyone's going to have the same likelihood of being paired with someone from a different background, whether it's race, sexual orientation, religion. So that's what I think is actually really unique about studying this roommate context is we can actually make even people who wouldn't opt in to an other race context through this policy, they're going to be forced to navigate that environment as well.
So, Sarah, in the first study that you did on this was at an institution that did have already on the books a random roommate assignment, or what was the nature of roommate assignments at Tufts, right? It was at Tufts?
Yep. So at Tufts University, which is where I got my PhD. So I did my first study with Sam Summers, my former advisor, and we did have a randomized roommate policy there. They did use a couple questionnaires to pair students up mainly on sleeping habits, being cigarette smokers or not, things along those lines. But it was already a well-adopted, well-accepted policy on Tufts campus at the time.
And so, at least in that first attempt to leverage this as a research tool, you outsource random assignment to the institution. What is it like? If you could sort of just kind of give us the gist of what that first study did, like what were you looking at, and what did you find?
Yeah, so as a graduate student, I was really interested in what can make interactions with people go better. Why is it that cross-race interactions in particular have to be so anxiety-provoking all the time. And reading a lot about contact theory, the majority of roommate work to date then was largely survey work, so different attitudinal measurements, yes, no questions, but there was no behavioral measurements of how contact might actually shape how I treat someone. And so being what I think is now a silly grad student and spent 2 years of my PhD career longitudinally following these students, because we actually didn't have a large enough sample just from 1 year of data collection. We had to do this across 2 years to get enough people to stick through a 3 time point sample. So we assessed them at the beginning of their fall, partway through their first year of college, and then we invited them to campus at the end of their freshman year. These were all white students only, importantly, to meet a Black student they had never met before. And we wanted to see if there were behavioral transfer effects in addition to attitudinal changes that we saw from students who were randomly assigned to live with an other race roommate. And we found that all of that was true. And you didn't have to live with a Black roommate, but living with an Asian roommate or a Latino roommate, we found these secondary transfer effects, as they're sort of called in the contact literature, and that any racial outgroup contact that was positive, when I had you meet a new Black or another racial outgroup member, you found that not only was that white participant feeling less anxious in that future context, but that Black interaction partner, who was a trained member on my research team, also felt more positive in that interaction. And we also coded for nonverbal behaviors. So even without explicit responses from anyone in the interaction, our coding team also saw increased eye contact, more smiling, more positive physical engagement. So I was really excited back as a grad student to have dedicated 2 years of my life to find some real world measurements that contact theory really can work, and not just in attitude changes, but also in these behavioral changes. And there's been very few behavioral studies looking at the effects stemming from this, particularly in college roommate settings.
Yeah, the behavioral finding was super important, it seems. And I wonder if we could sort of unpack it just a little bit more, because it'll come back later. If you could paint a little bit of a picture. So basically what happens is white college students who, by the gods of the college roommate assignment board, were assigned a roommate who was not also white, are brought into a lab and compared to what happens among white college students who are paired with white roommates, right? So that's sort of the stage, right? Like we have two groups of white college students who are brought into a lab. And what are they, can you sort of describe a little bit more, like what are they doing when they get there?
Yeah. So the standard cross-race interaction procedure in psychology is basically to make people as uncomfortable as possible. So there's a video camera plainly present in the room, so they know they're being videotaped. Usually most of these interactions are staged, so they think the person they're interacting with is another participant, but they're, of course, a trained member of your lab team. You draw out a topic out of a bowl, but the bowl is rigged, and they all say diversity issues on campus is the topic. The participant is always the person that's going to be interviewed. The confederate or the research assistant is always the person that's asking questions. So then that white student, at least in the case of our study, is sitting across the table from a Black student they've never met before while on video camera. And the Black student will then ask them questions such as, do you think affirmative action has benefited this campus? Please tell me why. So you can imagine how uncomfortable that is. But we want to see how, if they've had this extra added practice or exposure in the dorm, do we find that this very anxiety-driven situation is actually a little less anxious? And that's exactly what we ended up finding.
Because you have the videotapes, like you have, how did these white college students engage with a stranger when having these conversations? And you mentioned you had people code. So essentially, I think what that means is that they're watching these videotapes focused on the white college students and just marking down, like, how comfortable do they seem? Are they making eye contact? Do they seem to be friendly? And so this laundry list of things that they could be doing to show that they're comfortable or uncomfortable. And again, just to check that I have the finding right, white college students who had, but just through random chance, spent the previous, whatever, so many months with a roommate who was not white, were more comfortable in these interactions, like demonstrably more comfortable, to the point that some research assistant watching a videotape a week or so later was able to pick it out.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it wasn't just the white participant also, right? So the white participant felt more comfortable. Their Black interaction partner, who didn't know that the white student they were interacting with, if they had a same race or another race roommate, but our Black student, who was just another college undergrad, they also self-reported liking the white students who had other race roommates. So they felt more comfortable in this interaction as well, which I think is really important, that these types of policy changes potentially aren't only helping the white students, right? We're helping actually white and students of color on these campuses. And then, yeah, our coding team, my large, wonderful team of undergrads had to watch every single one of these videotaped interactions and code them for eye contact. And they noticed the exact same thing, that the white students just all physically looked much more comfortable, leaning more into the conversations, making more direct eye contact with the person across the table from them, and just looking more pleasant and positively affective overall.
I wonder if you have a take on like why this is such an important finding. Like, why is it that these interaction dynamics that we're finding effects on those is so notable? I think it might have something to do with what we were talking about before, having to do with anxiety. But I just kind of wanted to pitch it to you. I have this intuition that this is an important part of the puzzle. But for you, why was this such a like important thing to have found?
I'm not sure if Analia has stuff to add in after me, but for me as a social psychologist, I think we try so hard to understand behavior and to measure behavior, but we don't actually look at what's specifically causing behavioral changes. And we use these surveys and attitudes measurements all the time, but being able to see that this real world lived experience, right, that I didn't create as a researcher, this is something that 40 to 60% of our adolescent populations across the US are experiencing in college dorms. This natural experience is strong enough when the contexts are right. And importantly, all our roommates kind of liked each other, which I think is an important confound for our findings. Is strong enough to actually change this future anxiety you might have, right? And I think it really speaks to the fact that if we weren't living in such segregated contexts, those behavioral transfer effects we would see in anyone in any context. We just don't give ourselves enough time to see those behavioral changes.
Yeah, I think I'll just add on that I think it's easy to see how this could have like a positive, it could be a positive cycle, right? So if you start, the easier that these interactions become, the easier it is to have more of them. And it just kind of snowballs in a very positive way, which I think is something that is like an untapped avenue for improving attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah, particularly because it extends to a complete stranger. And I think, did the participants have any sense when they were recruited to this part of the study that it had anything to do with their roommates? Or you're just capturing unsuspecting college students in these potentially uncomfortable interactions, and it just so happens that some of them are more prepared for them than others?
Yeah, so in both studies, we had, through our previous data point measurements, asked them, would you like to be contacted for future paid study opportunities? So we had them opt in to be contacted. And then when we recruited them for the in-lab behavioral portion of the study, we said, hey, we heard you like making money in psych studies. Do you want to come to the lab and make $20? And so they didn't know it was linked to any of their previous roommate surveys or questionnaires. But, I do run a diversity lab, right? So there are certain expectations that when you show up to Sarah Gaither's lab on campus, right, or Sam Summers' lab at the time at Tufts, he also largely studies race and diversity issues. Certain students will know, oh, I'm probably maybe going to talk about race or something when I come here. So there is that other, lab feature that I think is important for ecological validity purposes in the future. But broadly, they didn't know it was linked to their previous responses.
So, okay, I mean, you did the study, you know that this works. So why do it all over again? Very recently, you both published a paper in which you essentially test the same question again. So what was on the table that a new investigation seemed worth it?
So I think for me, when I ran that study as a graduate student, I had a lot of limitations that made me really angry as a researcher. So we tried to recruit racial and ethnic minority students, for example, and just couldn't get enough of them to stick through all 3 time points. So again, I didn't want this to be measuring just outcomes for white students, but outcomes for all students on a college campus. That was one big motivating factor. And then also just in line with our replication crisis, again, a longitudinal roommate study is not something I think someone's ever going to try to replicate for fun because it takes way too long and way too much effort. But I wanted to know, was there something unique about the Tufts University sample, right? It is a predominantly white campus. They also pool their white students primarily from Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, which are 90% white states. So in this notion of intergroup contact theory, I sort of wondered, if we had students who had more previous contact, from other parts of the country, would these results change? Or if all of the students didn't love their roommates like they all loved each other at Tufts so much, could we find more of these, moderating factors and what predicts positive contact outcomes versus negative contact outcomes? So I had just never had a chance to follow up on it until I became faculty and had a little more time after postdoc life. And luckily, Analia came on board as my postdoc and really loves stats and digging into numbers and helping us figure things out. And we were able to craft a really strong narrative, I think, on trying to retest some of these limitations we had from the first study and largely replicating a lot of it, even with a racial ethnic minority sample. But Analia was really the powerhouse between making this paper happen. So I'll let her add in her own motivational aspirations at the time.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things that I was really excited about. I think including racial minority participants is super important, especially because I think contact has kind of this one-sided focus in a way of like it's majority group members that have the negative attitudes and they're the ones that need to fix it, like by just befriending minority groups and not really thinking about like what is that experience like for the people that they're having contact with. Is that that is a two-sided interaction that we don't always think about. So I thought that was really important to focus on both sides. And I think the policy was also really interesting because it provided a test of, again, other, like the policy change. So if you do stop, like allow being able to test the effect of randomized assignment as a more of like in an experimental way. Like if one year you could choose a roommate and then the next year we're able to see what happens when you aren't allowed. I thought that was a really interesting opportunity to explore that in the real world too.
Yeah, let's talk about that policy change, because it also seems like the opportunity was sort of served up for you. The world foisted this replication initiative onto you when your university was on the heels of making a change in their roommate assignment policy. So what was this pivotal moment at Duke that you were able to seize upon?
Yeah, so Duke, to be fair, historically, Duke a long time ago had a randomized roommate policy, I was told. And then they actually got rid of it for at least 30, 40 years. No one thought about it again. And then randomly before the class of 2021 entered at Duke, Duke knew I had done this previous roommate work in graduate school and said, "Hey, Sarah, do you want to come study some roommate policy outcomes?" And I said, "For free? As a poor social science researcher, you'll let me do that?" Sure. The IRB was a nightmare. It took me 6 months alone just to get IRB approval because of FERPA issues and education privacy laws and things of that sort. But it was a really unique chance for me to see, as Analia already said, this kind of naturally existing quasi-experimental design where we had one cohort of university data that was already collected before the randomized policy was in place. And then we could actually compare largely almost the same exact data for the next cohort when everyone was forced into this randomized roommate policy. So it just seemed like a researcher's dream come true. And I figured, well, I'm pre-tenure. I've been told I need to take some chances and try and do something big. So let's get some surveys out and do what we can. So I think what also made it an interesting time, even though, again, this was not my decision to change the policy, I became labeled very quickly on Duke's campus as the policy lady because students largely were really unhappy with the policy change. They thought Duke was taking away all students' autonomy to freely choose their roommates. They thought Duke was targeting students from underrepresented groups unfairly by taking away their option to have safe spaces in which to live. There were tons of op-eds in our student newspapers. NPR covered Duke as just doing this for diversity's sakes reasons. So this was a very hot topic for a solid year or two. But we didn't find any negative effects from the policy change. And now that it's been in place for a couple years, no one even remembers that students used to be able to choose a roommate. So again, this message from authority, right, as needed from a contact theory angle, I think was dicey at the beginning and students were upset, but the students who were mostly upset were actually the upperclassmen not the incoming freshmen, which is the group it was actually impacting, which I thought was really interesting. But the juniors and seniors just really wanted to protect those incoming first year students, and started big fights. But, based on our data, the policy change was a benefit for everyone.
Yeah, and it could be that, part of the uproar is like, we're able to do this well enough. Like we already sort ourselves into these like super diverse student groups. And so you could say that like this policy ends up doing nothing, right? It just sort of institutionalizes what's already happening, which is that people sort themselves into all sorts of roommate pairings. But one thing I didn't quite appreciate about the project until I really got into the paper was the opportunity you had to actually test, does a policy change actually make a difference in just the state of roommate assignments themselves? And so I wonder if we could start by speaking to that. Like what did anything actually happen in terms of how often roommate pairings were of same versus cross race students before and after the policy rolled out?
So we saw about a 10% increase in students living with roommates from another race background. So when only looking at racial outgroup changes in numbers, a 10% increase is actually pretty exponential, right? And having a pretty big impact on the student body. One thing that we didn't get to analyze as much, and Analia can talk more about this, is we know there was lots of other outgroup contact that was happening as well within these interactions. So we also have some evidence that increases in cross-sexual orientation roommates were happening, cross-international students, cross-income. So there's more than just the cross-racial component. That was just our largest sample size to actually do some data analysis with. But we are seeing that with this randomized roommate policy more broadly, students just aren't choosing a clone of themselves anymore, which is what they were doing before. They were moving to college with their bestie from their hometown and people who did all the same sports and ate all the same foods, and everyone now has an equal chance in being assigned to someone who at least eats something different, right? To give you that new perspective. Analia, what else do you have to add?
Yeah, the other dimensions, we just need like a way bigger sample size. So I think that's something that's like would be really exciting to collect, data over time with this kind of institutional data that's probably already being collected in lots of places to be able to see with something like sexual orientation. I think that was something that could have similar effects as having a racial outgroup roommate, but you just have such smaller sample sizes that it takes a number of people that are paired that it takes bigger sample sizes to be able to detect those effects.
I was wondering, your IRB nightmare makes me think this wasn't possible, but I have to imagine that the university has data on everybody who was assigned a roommate that year, which would include probably at least some course demographics. Were they just not? They weren't going to give those up for a full analysis of everybody?
So GPA and things like that were special for protected in different ways. So we had difficulty in getting access to everything. We got some GPA records. We have some incoming high school data, and we actually have a second paper we're working on right now that's looking at an even larger cohort of some other university data we got access to that's looking at study abroad aspirations, for example. So my new postdoc, Isha Naidu, and I have some cool results showing that living with an other race roommate, again, is actually increasing aspirations to study abroad. So you see these other willingness to want to go into other diverse spaces or diverse opportunities, this opting in kind of notion. I think the university was just very hesitant. We were allowed to ask 10 questions ourselves in some of the surveys that they sent out. We could add in 10 questions to try and measure certain specific contact things, but otherwise the majority of the data are nationally used surveys that are used by about 32 other private colleges and universities. So anyone who's listening to this and wants to see if this data replicates on your college campus, please let us know. We'd love to know, because a lot of the questions we used are in nationally used surveys on lots of campuses. So we were really just more limited to those types of surveys that could be anonymized a little more easily from the university standpoint, which was the big sticking point.
One other, in terms of characterizing these roommate relationships, given that your other interest in complex social identities, racial identities, can you define, how do you define in the study a cross-race roommate pairing?
Yeah, it was self-reported. So the question was worded like I think it was like describe which describes you best or something. And then it was my roommate and I are the same race, or I am blank and my roommate is not. So it was more based on self-identification and self-distinction than some like us determining whether they were in or out group. They were kind of self-defined without using those terms.
Yeah, and although the university had all the data of who was living with whom, race and ethnicity wasn't always collected on intake surveys from every student. And so the university didn't always have the most accurate. I also learned, since Analia and I are both diehard multiracial bicultural researchers ourselves, that Duke didn't keep track of multiracial, multi-ethnic students in the best way in their administrative records. They actually used only one of their identities and kind of grouped them in that way. So that made some of our calculations a little tricky at the beginning, which is why we opted into trying to use one of our 10 whole questions. We were allowed to get a more accurate rating of what racial and ethnic background our participants were.
I think I said it backwards. It was my roommate is blank and I am not. So not self-identifying and differentiating the roommate, but identifying the roommate and differentiating yourself. And there was an option for like, I don't know what race my roommate is. So we excluded those people.
So based on that, like specific group pairings. I ask because it seems like in the 2016 paper, you were able to have this interesting conclusion that even if your roommate was a different racial group than yourself, and also a different racial group than the person you're interacting with in the follow-up study, it's still contact is contact in that way. And so I was just curious, did you have a finer grained sense of just like, is it just different or same? Versus like, do you have a sense of like the different ways in which you could be paired with someone whose race is different than your own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The reviewers also had, so we looked into that a bit. And the biggest groups we had were white and Asian students. And so we did the analysis separately just for them. So people who had, that way out group was always either for white students, it was an Asian student, or for Asian students, it was a white student. And the results are largely the same when we do that sub-analysis. We lose power, of course, so some things aren't exactly the same, but the main patterns are similar. And then we couldn't look, I think I also looked at differentiating between, for the racial minority participants, whether they had a white outgroup roommate versus a different racial minority outgroup roommate. And there wasn't, these are all in like a massive supplemental materials. So you can look there to find the actual pattern of findings, but there wasn't anything that was super drastically different when I did these sub-analyses, just some things where we were less powered for. But within, and then as far as the behavioral transfer, it's actually mostly for the white students, they were interacted with a Black Confederate, but there was, most of the outgroup roommates were not Black. So we again didn't have enough power to fully test any difference there, but we can kind of, the bulk of the sample was experiencing extended contact in terms of the in-lab interaction for the white students. And then I think for the racial minority students, it's much more mixed. So that's, I think, an exciting area to test more systematically in the future too.
And that's pretty, so if I'm following right, you can kind of at least say it seems like just having a more racially diverse social experience as an incoming college student in general sort of has these kind of downstream consequences on comfort crossing these kinds of identity lines that students might not ordinarily be as comfortable doing. Does that seem right?
Yeah, and I think that's...
Go ahead, Analia.
I think we're going to say the same thing. Like the main finding that we saw across all the studies was the friendship diversity. Is that what you're going to say?
Yep, exactly right. I think that's the main pathway, right? That not only were they having this roommate exposure and this roommate practice effect, but we find for all students, regardless of their race or ethnicity, right? So majority and minority students all had this significantly more diverse friend network. So you're getting actually more practice experience even outside of your dorm, right? But it seems very key that you need this outgroup roommate in order to start that friendship expansion. So I think this is why we're still seeing, especially for our white students in the behavioral study, this very strong transfer effect that even though a lot of them didn't have a Black roommate, they're still having all of this outgroup contact that's causing them to then navigate this future interaction space more positively, regardless of that matching.
Since you have more power than you did before, are there any plans to recontact this cohort in a couple of years as they move through their college experience?
So the sad thing with this cohort, if you think about them entering as the class of
Oh, yeah.
2022, what happened 2 years into their college
Uh,
time? COVID. So we had very big plans to follow them for all 4 years of college to see how this policy change would shift things. But COVID happened. All students were kicked off campus. There were no social interactions of any kind, no contact except through Zoom. So all of my big dreams as a poor junior faculty member were killed in the COVID era. Um, there is a new development here at Duke this year, which I actually just got contacted about. We have a new curriculum change on the horizon here. And so, although it's not a roommate policy, they're trying to develop these new, what they call constellation courses at Duke, which is a required set of 3 to 4 kind of core classes freshmen would take during their first year. And they reached out to me based on this roommate finding at Duke just a couple weeks ago to see if I'd be interested in trying to figure out what combination of classes might also foster more diverse interactions between students, right? So if you have students take a biology class or a pottery making class combined with a public policy class, right? These three very distinct areas of research, would you find students who opt into those kinds of combinations of courses? Do they see more diverse friend networks? Do they see more flexible thinking outcomes? So I think these other types of policy changes, even outside of a roommate context, are kind of exciting to think about as well as other ways to create contact experiences during college.
yeah, I wonder too if this work makes either of you think of other contexts. Like we have learned a lot about the potential of random roommate assignments, but would you say that that is like the main takeaway, or is there sort of a kind of broader, more abstract conclusion that for you this really signals?
I mean, it leaves me with a lot of questions. I think one thing that we still like, it's, yeah, yes, you drop into college, and that's um, a lot of new things and new experiences for a lot of people. But you have been these students have been existing in the world for oftentimes 18 years ish before they start college. So being able to better quantify what those like high school experiences were like how diverse were their high schools going into college? Does that make a difference for students who are in this either like in more diverse majors in the classroom or in a roommate relationship? Do they like does that do they opt into different majors because of their past experience in terms of like these kind of contact through a contact lens? I think there's still a lot to explore. I mean, roommate, yes, is like one specific context, but I think the broader classrooms, majors as communities is also an exciting, and thinking about kind of what they're bringing in as well.
And I think for me, the first other, I think, needed step, as Analia mentioned before, our behavioral findings for our racial and ethnic minority students were very mixed and a lot harder for us to take a clean takeaway result from that. And the reason that is because all of our minorities, when they came into the lab for the behavioral study, interacted with a white Confederate or a white research assistant, which is not a perfect design because Duke is a predominantly white campus still. So this isn't the first white person, right, they've ever talked to in their life. I'm just assuming. So the comparison point, right, is not equivalent for white students and students of color in this design. So I do think it's important for us to consider how contact may manifest itself differently for students of color versus white students. But then from a graduation angle, I've also been in discussion with some Duke alumni, and I actually have a talk later today with some affinity groups to see how their experiences in college may transfer to their interactions in workplaces or how randomly assigned cubicles, right? So you think about all the cubicle setups that we have across workplaces now, especially in the startup and industry context. And if you have an open concept in an office space versus closed office concepts, there's some organizational work to suggest that open floored concepts increase interactions and communications between people than having individual closed offices. Even having windows as your walls of offices, right, where you can open and close your blinds can also increase eye contact between people of different backgrounds. So I'm really interested in those types of structural physical changes within workplaces or buildings and how that might actually foster more versus less contact between folks too outside of college.
That's great. And by way of wrapping up, I had sort of as I was prepping for this, maybe a provocative ending question, which is just like, do you get the sense that contact is the most promising tool we have for addressing bias? It just sort of seems like as a field, we keep coming back to contact. It's been a long time that this idea has been around. And I feel like people's intuitions are that contact works. We keep finding evidence that is consistent with contact. For you, do you go like, this is the one to run with, or are you not quite convinced yet?
I'm 100% in. There's no ambiguity for me in any way, shape, or form. I think every participant who comes into my lab, especially families, we do a lot of developmental work with young kids. They always ask me, what's the number one thing I can do to make my kid grow up and be a good person? And I say, take them to lots of different events, show them lots of different things, have them meet lots of different types of people, because we don't put ourselves in new situations, right? So finding comfort in your discomfort, go to that book reading you never thought you would go to before, or try that new type of food with a friend. I mean, this is what your life is, right? Life is so short, so you might as well experience things. You don't have to like everything that you try, but I would challenge everyone listening to this that the more things you try, the happier you're going to be in your life, because you'll have that many more things to talk about with everyone else. So I do think contact under these specific conditions, which is what's so hard to control. There's lots of political contexts that don't support cross-group contact, for example. So if we shift our rhetoric and ideologies to argue for more segregation, that's probably going to make everything worse, in my opinion, right? When you follow what we've been documenting for decades and decades in psychology. So I think the more contact we can have, the better, as long as we can create those equal senses of hierarchy and things like that, which is the harder thing to control for in the real world. But 100%, everyone, please go meet someone new. Say hi to that person on the bus every day you sit next to them. It can make a world of difference, in my opinion.
I think I will add, just so I'm also like a believer in this approach. I will just add my little bit of caution, I guess, maybe, or a question I still have. A lot of these outcomes are things like are individual based, like individual racial attitudes, friendships. Like, yes, with friendships, we're thinking a little bit more about groups, but I don't know that we know exactly whether this is the best way forward for changing big policies or kind of making bigger societal changes that address inequality in a bigger, like, government type of way. So I think that doesn't mean that I don't think this is a great way forward. I think we just, I guess, should be thoughtful about the level of solution that we propose for the level of problem that we're trying to address. So if we're trying to address, broad economic inequality in the whole country, contact is probably not the best suited tool for that. So just not overselling, I guess, what we can hope for.
Yeah, there is some work that shows that contact has changed attitudes, but then attitudes toward Black people, for example, you like them better, you think more favorably of them. But then when I ask you, how much do you support a Black Lives Matter policy change or foundation support, people don't show a matching congruence there, right, with their positive attitude changes and policy endorsements. So I think that's important. But the small caveat I would say as one piece of hope is that since this policy change at Duke, students have actually all been very much behind the randomized roommate policy. So many students who I've talked to since then have said, I really wasn't sure about it at first. But now that I've seen how it's happened, now that I've seen how much happier our campus is, this increased belonging for everyone. So I think there's sort of this notion where we have to take a step sometimes in order to show people the effects of a policy to allow that buy-in later. So I do think this is at least one small sliver of hope that in some cases, the evidence might support policy endorsement, at least after the fact, right? Maybe not in support of putting the policy in place initially, but yeah, so time will tell.
Well, this is great. I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to talk about this, and also kudos on pulling off like several large-scale roommate longitudinal style studies. I think they're super important, and thanks for talking about them.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much thank you for the invitation.
Alrighty, that'll do it for this episode of Opinion Science. Big thank you to Sarah Gaither and Analia Albuja for taking the time to talk about their work. You can find links to their websites on the episode webpage, as well as links to the studies we talked about. For more on this show, hop on over to opinionsciencepodcast.com, where you'll find all the past episodes and other fun stuff. Subscribe to the show on your podcast player of choice and tell the world about it. The moment you hear someone utter the word podcast, you should say to them, "Do I have a show for you?" But a quick heads up, I'm actually going to take a brief summer break from the show. So no new episode in 2 weeks' time like usual, and the plan now is to take July off from posting new episodes. I know. What are you going to do in July without me? You'll find something. I trust you. But you may have noticed that this is episode 99, and I would like to do something special for episode 100, and I just haven't had the time to get it done. So I'm going to take a few extra weeks to slow down, and I'll be back in August with episode 100 of Opinion Science, and then back to regular episodes after that. Okay? You'll be okay without me? All right. Well, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in August for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.